The bottom line for our metal unit cells then is that how the atoms of the crystal pack determines how dense the material is going to be in some respects, because different packing geometries, how the spheres fit together, means that space is filled more closely or more efficiently in the cube. So for instance, in your simple cubic unit cell, this is our least efficient packing geometry. If you were packing spheres yourself, you wouldn't try to pack one sphere right on top of the other spheres. The spheres in our real world, which are not connected the same way atoms are, could roll past each other and leave big void gaps or empty spaces, and it results in not a very efficient packing of the material into a space. Body-centered cubic is a little more efficient, where a single atom at the center is kind of supporting 8 neighboring atoms around it. In a face-centered cubic packing, the packing geometry is more efficient still, and it leads to the least amount of unused or empty space in how the spheres are packed. And the efficiency of this packing is reflected in the unit cell itself, where you can see in the unit cell in a simple cubic system, there's a large amount of empty space inside the confines of the unit cell, whereas there's less in a body-centered cubic unit cell, and there's still less in a face-centered cubic unit cell. If we look at how much of each of these unit cells are actually occupied by the metal atoms, face-centered cubic is the most efficient, where the atoms fill up most of the space and there's less empty space inside the unit cell. Body-centered cubic is pretty efficient, but not as efficient as face-centered cubic, and simple cubic is the least efficient. So if you looked at the 3 packing geometries in terms of the space that's actually occupied in the unit cell, simple cubic is the least efficient with only 52% of the unit cell's volume filled by atoms. Body-centered cubic is quite a bit more efficient with 68% of the unit cell's volume actually occupied by metal atoms. And cubic close packed, which is another term for face-centered cubic, is the most efficient with 74% of the space of the volume in the cubic unit cell actually being occupied by atoms. And as a result, this actually means that if we look at the portions of the atoms that define the unit cell that are actually inside the unit cell, there are more atoms in the face-centered cubic unit cell than in the body-centered cubic unit cell and in the simple cubic unit cell. Hopefully you saw an example of this in the video, but in our unit cell, remember that the unit cell is actually defined as a cube inside of atoms. So we have corners of the atoms at the corners of the unit cell in a simple cubic unit cell with an empty space in the center. So you have essentially 8 corners of atoms that define your cubic unit cell. So keep in mind that when we're talking about these metal unit cells, they're not defined by atoms stacking on top of each other. The unit cell actually takes slices of atoms that define it at the corner, and everything inside this box constitutes the unit cell. So if you're looking at a simple cubic unit cell, you have 8 slices of atoms at the corners that define the unit cell. Each of these slices that occupy the corners is an eighth of a whole atom. So you have 8 1/8ths of an atom inside a simple cubic unit cell, and you have the equivalent of 1 atom of the material that actually fits in the unit cell. It's not one single atom, it's 8 1/8ths of 8 different atoms. 8 times 1/8, 1 atom. Go back and check that out in the video, the YouTube video that I linked, because it actually shows you how to fold the spheres up in your mind. I think it makes it a little bit more revealing. In a body-centered cubic unit cell, we talk about it as 2 atoms actually fit in the BCC unit cell, because we have an atom at the center and we still have 8 1/8ths of other atoms at the corner of the unit cell. So if we fold up all these eighths of atoms and we count them together, we now have 1 atom at the center, 8 times 1/8 at the corners. We have 2 atoms that can fit in the body-centered cubic unit cell. But in the FCC, face-centered cubic or close-packed cubic unit cell, we actually can fit 4 atoms in a unit cell of this material, because now we have half an atom at each face. The atoms at the faces of the unit cell have been sliced in half. So we have 6 faces, because it's a cube. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 times 1/2, that's 3 atoms inside the unit cell. And then we have 8 1/8 of atoms at the corner again, so we can actually fit 4 atoms of the metal inside the face-centered cubic unit cell. It's not 4 whole atoms, it's 6 halves of different atoms and 8/8 of other atoms, but they still pack tighter and fill the space more efficiently. And again, another reflection of the fact that cubic unit cells use space more efficiently as you go from simple cubic to body-centered cubic to face-centered cubic. And you can look at that either as the space inside the cell, the volume of the cell is used to pack atoms more efficiently, or you can think of that as more atoms fit inside the unit cell, the more efficiently the atoms are packed. So this will be the end of the exam 2 material. When we come back after exam 2, we're going to pick up and talk about how we use what we've learned today about the basic crystal structures and the basic unit cells of metals to calculate properties like atomic radius or density of the metal using measurements obtained through a technique called X-ray crystallography. Good luck with exam 2. If you have any questions about exam 2, I will be online on Zoom on Friday, so you can ask me questions about material or format before you take the exam. And I will be try to be as available as possible through email all weekend. Remember, the exam format is a little different for this exam. It means that you get more time overall, but it means that the exam is going to be administered in 2 separate parts. So there'll be a part for the multiple choice questions, and there'll be a part for the short answer and free response questions. Good luck on the exam, and I'll see you back here next week.